So Mongoose models, again, are to declare our blueprint. What does our data look like? So this is the last directory we need to introduce to our backend at this point. We're going to make one more directory, and we're going to call it models. So we have a models directory, we have a routes directory, we have our node modules directory, and we have our client directory, which is our whole front end. So routes, this is how we interact with our data. Models, this is what our data looks like. So this is, my application is an application for animals. You will call this whatever is appropriate for your application, whether it's bounty or to do. But since we are declaring the blueprint here, we won't use a plural word. I will say something like animal, because I am going to create a file that declares this is what an animal object should look like. So animal.js or todo.js or bounty.js, depending on which one you're doing. Created a directory called models, and we put a new file in there for whichever application you're working on, bounty or to do.
Are we supposed to have that
No, that's a plugin I have that I'll show you guys again later. It helps get everything working. Yeah, it's not a React file, but it's thinking it is because we have React stuff in here. No, this is on the backend models folder. No client interaction at this time. Okay, inside of our model files, we need to pull in Mongoose. So const mongoose equals require Mongoose. Now there's a specific part of the Mongoose package called a schema. It's a constructor, and I don't want to have to say mongoose.schema, mongoose.schema, over and over again. So I'm not actually going to pull that into its own variable as well. I'm going to say const uppercase schema equals mongoose.schema. But we're not calling it like express router. We're just saving the constructor function in a variable. Well, it's kind of like a constructor function with a whole lot of features.
And that's why it's capitalized, because it is a constructor.
Exactly. Now, before we need to declare our schema now, whatever we're creating. So mine's for animals, again, whatever yours is for, but you will say const, and then the word animal or bounty schema equals a new schema, just like that. So schema needs an object passed into it. So in the parentheses, you'll create an object bracket and then you'll hit return. So you can start filling out what the schema should look like. Yep, this is just, now we're just filling out the blueprint. Once we have our schema declared, I do this before we start filling it out. This needs to be accessible to other files. So we'll need to module.exports something. Now, what is the other word I was using instead of schema? Or it basically is the same thing as a schema, but it was another word I was using. Yes, but no. Model, there we go. Sorry, there's 3 words. So what we want to export is a mongoose.model. So this is, we're going to generate a model from our blueprint. And this method needs 2 arguments. One is the model name, and 2 is the model's schema. So the model name, this is uppercase conventionally. It doesn't have to be, but it should be. So I'm going to say capital A animal. That is the name of this model in my database. What an animal should look like. And the blueprint it should use is the animal schema. So we declare our schema by making a new schema object. And then we export a new Mongoose model called something, And then we reference the schema it should use whenever we're creating or using this something. So what are we actually exporting from this file? A model. So it's this model that we're exporting, and this is the thing we can use to create new animals and also query our database for existing animals. This capital A animal word is what we're going to be using inside of our routes to interact with this data.
Instead of setting up, so whenever you're setting Axios, but post instead of setting up a new object.
On the front end, it's still the same. You just send an object. And the back end will handle it. We'll grab that object. Yep. It is not. We do not define the ID. Mongoose will automatically give that to it when we create a new animal. So now we need to define what it is to be an animal. What are the properties we want to save? So I'm going to go to my fake data here and see that we have a type, a species, and a sound. So I'm going to say you're going to have a type. And what data type is type going to be? So capital S string tells it to be a string. Comma. Next type, we have species. It is what data type? String. And then the sound, string. So this would be a very basic model. But we're saying whenever an animal is created, it can have a type and or a species and or a sound. But when they send you this data and save it in the database, they have to be strings. So if you accidentally sent a number or a Boolean, it would be rejected. The database would throw an error and say, I can't save that because Mongoose is enforcing this. This is where all the rigidity comes into play that SQL has by default. In this case, yeah, we're going to play with a couple other types here just to see what they look like. But none of these are required. So technically, I could still send an empty object to my database and it can save it. So instead of just saying, species is a string, maybe we want to require species. So what we do is instead of just saying string, we would open up object brackets. And now we can give more properties about this key to further enforce whether or not it has to be saved and what format. So instead of just saying species string, we now give the species a type of string. And sorry, don't get confused with this. This is the name of the key because that's the name we chose for our data here, which I'm actually going to change now for lack of confusion's sake. So we'll just say animal. And so my schema has an animal. But if you open it up a configuration object like this to declare more things about this key, you have to open it up and then give it the data type it should be. But now you can give other things like it's required. Well, now when they send you an animal object, if it doesn't have a species, it won't save it to the database. It's required. There's other settings. There's things like lowercase. When you save it in the database, even if they send you an uppercase word, save it as lowercase text. So you can do that. There's quite a few of these options. Right. Right. Yep. Yes. Yeah. So let's look at the other data types. Right now, you have to send the species. Let's also make sure they have to send the animal. And again, adapt this for your own purposes on your schema. Yeah. Posts. Yeah, required is saying if you create an animal object, the first time it's created, it has to have this key. It always has to have this key.
So if you don't require,
right. Yeah. Now required makes it so the user has to give you this input. But what if you didn't want them to have to give it to you, but you still wanted a default value? Instead of required true, I could say the default for all animals is mammal. And now if they don't give me a species, it will put mammal in its place and save it as mammal. And you can also say required true. Now, if they don't give it to you, I mean, this is kind of redundant because this is going to be saved anyways, but you can give default values. I'm going to keep that. But let's look at some other data types here with models. Yeah. So how about is extinct? I know, depressing, but what data type would this be? Boolean, okay. Well, they may not give me data for it, so I'd say the type would be a Boolean. And by default, we're gonna hope that they are not extinct. No, false, false, false. Is extinct is false. Okay, maybe what's a numerical value for animals? Price on black market. No, that's too dark. Age, yeah, that's a lot lighter. Thank you. Type, number. And maybe this one isn't required. So we just say it doesn't need any other setting. We just say age should be a number if they send it to you. If they don't, they can always send it to you later in a put request and create it. We're just saying this is what the blueprint supports. And they don't have to send this the first time. They could send it on a put request later when they update this object. So there's the primitive data types, string, Boolean, number, but what about objects and arrays? Can you nest data types in your schemas? You can. Now there's rules that's a bit more advanced that we'll get to later. There's rules about this to make it easier. You don't want huge nested arrays of objects with arrays. In that case, you'd split things into different collections. But maybe it has an array of sibling species, like species it's related to. I'm trying to be creative here. How would I say array? Well, I wouldn't say array. What I would say is expect an array of strings. And that's how you declare an array data type with a model. You say it's going to be an array of this type of data. And what's usually safe to do with complex data types is to say type should be an array of strings. And it's default. If they don't give you anything by default, make sure it's an empty array. So if we're using that at all in our logic, there's at least an empty array to look at. And that's probably good for now. I want us to get more to using it. We can get more into the complexities of this later.
So it's like basically setting up
No, it's setting up what my data needs to look like. So if I save something to my database and it's an animal, it has to look, the object I send in my post request has to look like this. Yep, it'll throw an error and say, you know, error, you didn't send me what I was looking for. Yeah, so like image URL would be a type of string. Yeah, so that'd be more like the to-do. If you like dates, if you like timestamps, so you want to know when this object's created, you can make something like a timestamp, which would be a type of date. And maybe the default would be date.now. So when this gets created, it gets a timestamp of the second it's created, you know. And this is what you'd use on like Twitter to say this was posted 2 hours ago. When it's created, it gets timestamped. So you can use some logic and say, hey, the timestamp was 2 hours ago and post that. I'm going to comment these out because they're not in the data that I'm going to be saving, but I'll make sure they're in the notes so you can see different examples. But there's a lot. So if you go to the write-up, Mongoose Schemas, we show a few examples of like type and required and unique. Enums we'll talk about. But if you go to their documentation, these are all the constructs you can use. Like we've seen string, number, date, Boolean. You can declare arrays if you don't want to say the data type inside. And that gives you an example of all of them. So if you wanted an object, you'd say open it up, it's an object of these values. Okay, so I have my animal schema now. It can take an animal, which is required, a species, which is required, and a sound, which is just not required. And I'm exporting that model. In my server.js doesn't need to know about this model. What needs to know about this model is what is interacting with it. So what file would be interacting with this portion of the database? Anyone know? My router. My router interacts with this piece of data. So I'm going to delete my fake database now. We never ever need it again. Yay. Which means all my routes just broke. So yay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull in my model. I'm going to say const capital A animal, the name of my model, equals require from my models folder the animal.js. So yours would be maybe like const to do equals require models to do.js. Everything pretty much. My fake database, my routes, all of it. The routes will look the same. The stuff inside, it's going to be different now.
So you're going to need you like.
Nope. Mongoose is going to do that for us. So we're going to do get and post and then call it good for now. Get a lot of time today to practice with that. But this is where we should be now. And just for clarity's sake, I'm going to split these into separate. I'm not going to use the .route syntax. I'm going to say animalrouter.get and animalrouter.post. So the get request is still the /, and we still get the rec, res, and next object, or next is the function, rec and res are the objects. But before we had fake database, right? All I have to say is res.send my animals. Well, now I need to tell my Mongoose model to go look at MongoDB and see if any animal objects exist. If so, send them all back. So this will be the Mongoose get all. What was the method we used for finding a single object in an array? Find. So that is actually the method that Mongoose has. It's a different type of find, but it says go find everything that matches this model. So we're going to say animal.find. And what this will come back with, this will go search the database, and it's going to come back with a callback function. Just like our route gets rec and res, this is going to go search the database, but it's asynchronous. It's going to take a second. And so when it comes back, it's going to come back with one of two things, either an error or all of the animals from our database. Now, we haven't handled errors yet on the back end, but it is a convention in Node that you handle your errors first. Because if something goes wrong, let's not try to send data back before handling the thing that went wrong. Let's handle the thing that went wrong first. So when this comes back, the first thing we're going to do is ask, was there an error? And if there was an error, we want to set the status to an error status, and we want to send the user that error. We don't want to send a response. We want to send an error so their .catch receives it and can display the error. So the first thing we'll do is say the response status should be 500. That means something went wrong between the interaction of API to database. It's a standard server error code. And then we're going to return res.send the error. But why return? If res.send ends your server process, why am I saying return?
That's part of fine.
What's that?
Because you're using the fine, which is.
Promise
You're gonna
base.
send that to the, basically you found the error, you're sending it back to the fine.
It's that, and also we're only handling the error here. So now I'm going to handle it if it goes well. If I don't say return here, it's going to res.send and then it may finish the rest of the function before ending the server process, and I don't want the rest of the code to run. So this is the end of the line if an error occurred. So let's return out of the function and send the following. So now we can handle it if things went well. So if it checks there was not an error, then by line 12, that means things went well. We got our animals back. So what we want to return in this case is a successful status of 200. Things are good. And then we can just chain onto it a .send and send our animals. And there is the get all in its base form. Because it was all the fake database stuff.
What would you be able to avoid the other return did like the second one, for the second? Well, say the rest does that to 100 else.
Yeah, you could, and you wouldn't have to return, but there's multiple ways to write it. Okay, so we're gonna, yeah, if you're opening up the terminal and you see a giant error, you wanna scroll to the top of it. Like if I did this, it'll say Notamon crashed and shows me all this. I'll scroll up and see at the top what it's saying the error is, and then I'll search here for a line number. We're almost there, I assure you. We're going to end here at the get all route and do post after lunch, just for the sake of not going too long on this. But at this point, I want everyone to try to test it. Everyone should start up their server, open up Postman, and do a GET request to your endpoint. And if it works, what you will get is an empty array. It says, I queried your database and no animals were found.
Also, that's what I'm trying to.
Yeah, you'll always want to test it in Postman firstly. So start up your server, do a GET request, get back an empty array, call it a success.